We're back with Lecture 7, and Lecture 7 is chapters 21 through 27. And again, remind ourselves of the general outline. The prologue is chapters 1 and 2, and that's the narrator. The dialogue is chapters 3 through 42. That's the heart of the book, and that's Job's speeches with his three friends. And then the epilogue, or the conclusion, is in chapter 42. 7 through 40, or 7 through 17, and that's the narrator again. And remember, in the heart of the book, there are three cycles, and the first cycle is chapter 3 through 11, and the second cycle, chapter 12 through 20, and then the third is chapter 21 through 31. I thought in this video that we'd cover that whole complete third cycle, but it's looking like we're just not going to go that far. We'll just go to chapter 27. But again, some don't begin the cycles with chapter 3 because that's Job's soliloquy, and that's Job when he wishes that he hadn't been born, and then he has been born, and he wishes that he would have died at birth. So this third cycle in chapter 21, and we'll look at the whole outline and structure of this, but we'll probably just get through chapter 27. But in chapter 21 is the seventh speech of Job, and that's counting that one in Job chapter 3. In chapter 22 is the third speech of Eliphaz, and then in Job 23 and 24 is the eighth speech of Job, and then Job 25 is the third speech of Bildad, and then the ninth speech of Job, which is really three speeches altogether because the friends don't speak anymore after 25. And we'll look at 26 and 27. Now notice here you have Eliphaz in chapter 22, Bildad in chapter 25, interspersed by Job between them. And then Job speaks again, and we expect Zophar to speak. But there is no third speech of Zophar. Like they run out of steam in this third cycle. Chapter 21, 1 through 34 is the seventh speech of Job. It's the third cycle of speeches in the dialogue. And the structure of this is verses 1 through 3 is his opening plea. And then verses 4 through 26, his discussion on the prosperity of the wicked. You remember some of the friends have been talking about that. And then 21, 27 through 34, his challenge to his friends. Now, when we talk about the prosperity of the wicked, there's the why do bad things happen to good people, and then there's a question, why do good things happen to bad people? Or if it were possible for a wicked man to be seemingly blessed, then it's also possible for a righteous man like Job to be seemingly cursed. The friends can't see this because they hold to retributive justice, and that's the order that's in the universe. Job wants them to be astonished, as he is, at the evidence that he will show them that the wicked prosper, they grow old, and they die in peace. In Job's experience, many of the wicked are never faced with misfortune or suffering. Now, his arguments here challenge the whole moral order of the universe. Zophar just said, as we saw in the last lecture, in lecture 6 and lecture 6 continued, that the wicked die prematurely. He says that in verses 4 through 11 of chapter 20. Well, Job insists that instead the wicked live and become old. They don't die prematurely, and God gives them wealth, health, and long life to many of the wicked. The Jewish Talmud commented, "It is not in our power to explain the prosperity of the wicked and the suffering of the righteous." And really there are two perspectives to approach this topic of suffering. One is from an intellectual perspective, intellectual standpoint, and the other is from an emotional standpoint. And the two don't always coincide. It's emotional for Job. It's just an intellectual discussion, maybe a theological discussion for the friends. And they keep insisting that Job has sinned so as to deserve what he's going through. one person says both Job and his friends didn't understand God's ways. Yet there were two significant differences between Job and his friends. First, his friends confidently claimed that they did understand, while Job admitted that he's perplexed. A second thing, for Job's friends, these were matters of theological and moral theory and interesting topics for discussion. For the severely suffering Job, these were life and death questions. And Job here in this chapter challenges some proverbs about the prosperity of the wicked. A couple of them are given here. And we'll have to see these when we get to Proverbs. But chapter 10, verse 3, the Lord will not allow the righteous to hunger, but he will reject the craving of the wicked. Job would say, well, not always. And then chapter 12, verse 21, no harm befalls the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble. The righteous have enough to satisfy his appetite, but the stomach of the wicked is in need, in chapter 13, 25. Job argues that these are not true in all circumstances. And Job's not alone in this, because the psalmist in Psalm 73 wrestled with the problem of the prosperity of the wicked. He almost lost his faith over that issue, and we'll look at that when we get to the book of Psalms. To say a little bit more before we look at the chapter 22, well, we need to go through 21. But there was a Rabbi Elisha ben Aviyah, and he became upset over his faith. There are two passages in Torah that promise long life. Let me read these. The first is Exodus 20 and verse 12, and it's from the Ten Commandments. Exodus 20 and verse 12. And it says, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. And this, Paul quotes this in Ephesians, that your life may be long upon the earth. So notice here, there are two commands in Torah that have attached to them promise of a prolonged life. You honor your father and mother, your days will be prolonged in the land that the Lord gives you. The other passage in Torah, the only other passage in Torah that has attached to it a promise of long life, is found in Deuteronomy 22 and verse 7. And this, let me back up to verse 6. If you happen to come upon a bird's nest along the way, in any tree or on the ground with young ones or eggs, and the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. You shall certainly let the mother go, but the young you may take for yourself. And notice here again, in order that it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days. So, honor your father and mother, you may prolong your days. You let the mother go, mother bird go. You may take the young, in order that you may prolong your days. Now the rabbi is talking about Rabbi Elisha ben Aviyah. He saw a man climb up in a tree and take the mother, going against this command here. And he came, climbed back down the tree, and everything was all right. And then he saw a young boy, his mother told him to climb up into the tree and to let the mother go and take the young. And that's what he did. He climbed up in the tree. And then as he's coming down with the young, he fell out of the tree and he died. And Rabbi Elisha ben Aviyah was really upset of this, because he said, there's a man who disregarded that command and he lived, but then here is a young boy who honored two commands that have promise of long life, and yet he died. And so Job is really upset, and he says that it appears to me that the wicked don't suffer. Things go all right with them. He's contradicting the claims of other friends. I mean, Bildad said in chapter 18, verse 5, how often is the lamp of the wicked put out? And Job says, well, I don't see it. I don't see it very often. And he says, be astonished with this. And then in verse In verse 3 of chapter 21 of Job, he says, listen to me, and then after that you may mock. Now, here's an interesting thing. In that verse, the verbs in that verse, and also in the chapter, the verbs in this chapter, so far the verbs have been plural. This verb is singular, and it may be that Zophar is making a point here of addressing Zophar. I'm especially offended by what you said, and after I say what I'm going to say about the prosperity of the wicked, then you, singular, mock on. Or he may be saying you won't be able to mock after this. Remember, even when I remember, he says, I'm frightened and horror takes hold of me. Turn and lay your hand on your mouth. Be astonished at this. The mystery of God's moral government in allowing the wicked to prosper, that's what Job is about to confront them. And he says, this is going to leave you astonished and even frightened. Why do the wicked old? Do they grow old in power? See, Job is not seeking to just win a theological argument. It's a problem for him. Why do the wicked prosper? Why should a good God allow the wicked to prosper? Their seed is established in their sight. And a lot of these words are echoing what Zophar has just said. He said their houses are saved without fear. They send forth their little ones, and their little ones dance. It's like a festive occasion. Verse 11, they skip about with the timbrel and the harp and the flute, and they spend their days in prosperity. And then in peace they go down to the grave. They go down to Sheol. And yet they say to God in verse 14, depart from us. We do not even desire the knowledge of your ways. They openly flaunt God. They're irreligious. What is the Almighty who is the Almighty that we should serve him? And what gain will we get from him? Their prosperity is not in their hand, Job says in verse 16. It must come from somebody. It comes from God. The counsel of the wicked is far from me, Job says. I think he's saying, now understand, I'm not saying I should be wicked as they are, because he's always upholding his righteousness. But God prospers them. Calamity rarely overtakes the wicked. How often is the lamp of the wicked put out? In Job 18:5, Bildad had just claimed the light of the wicked shall be put out. But Job is saying basically, well, what examples can you give me in proof of that? That their calamity comes on them. He distributes pain in their anger. The wind blows. It's like the wicked are blown as straw. Now, how often are the wicked blown as straw? In verse 19, it appears that God lays up iniquity for a man's sons. Now let God repay him so that he may know it. Let him drink of this wrath. But he says it appears that God is prospering him. Shall God teach him any knowledge? Verse 23, one dies in his full strength, wholly at ease, and satisfied in his perfection, in the full enjoyment of having the cup filled of life just filled full. That's the wicked. His sides are are filled with fat. The marrow of his bones is moist. It means it's figurative of being well nourished and prosperous. While another dies with a bitter soul, never even tasting anything good. Now, together they lie down in the dust. In verse 27, he continues about the fate of the evil one. He says, I know your thoughts and the plans which you wrong me. You say, where is the house of the noble? Where is the tent, dwelling place of the wicked? You go out here, Job says, and you ask in verse 29, travelers along the road. They have a wide perspective. They've traveled a lot. They know the happenings of the world, and they'll tell you a different story than what you're saying. They can give instances. They can let me see if I can find the verse 29. Their witness, they can give tokens of their the witness of how the wicked are spared. Now, I know that evil is reserved for the wicked for a day of calamity, but what I observe is that they many times prosper now. The clods of the valley will gently cover them. Valleys were commonly chosen for burial places. A life of unbroken happiness. They lay down in full measure, and then they are gently covered with the clods of the valley. How will you vainly comfort me? Your answers are full of falsehood. Now, in chapter 22 is the third speech of Eliphaz, and it's in the third cycle of speeches in the dialogue. And the structure of this is the introduction, verse 1. It's just like, then Eliphaz the Temanite responded. Then verses 2 through 20, Eliphaz argues that Job's wickedness is great, and he urges Job to return to God. Let's go through this, and then we'll look in verse 24 at the gold of Ophir. Chapter 22 is this speech of Eliphaz, where he argues, and really, it's just back and forth the same thing. It's cold logic. Eliphaz is arguing that God has nothing personally to gain by afflicting Job. And he says, don't follow the path of wicked men in the past. Verse 5, is not your wickedness great and your iniquities without end? You must have done something. And he gives a list of different things that he thinks Job might have done. You've taken pledges of your brothers without cause, in verse 6. Later Hebrew law would say that the creditor had to return the garment at nightfall, and Eliphaz accuses Job of stripping men naked. You have not, in verse 7, given water to the weary, and from the hungry you've not given them anything to eat. You withheld bread. You were able to help them, but you've withheld bread. And the earth belongs to the mighty man. The honorable man dwells in it. You've sent widows away empty, verse 9, and you've crushed the strength of orphans. Therefore, snares surround you, in verse 10. Because of this, snares surround you. It's retribution for your sins. God's doing all of this. And our darkness that you can't see, an abundance of water covers you. Now, Job is accused of impiety. Is God not high above you? And he can survey everything that happens on earth, and you're saying you understand everything. Look at the stars, how high they are. But you say, what does God know? Can he judge through this thick darkness, through the dark clouds in which he's enveloped? In verse 14, the clouds are a hiding place for him, so he cannot see. And he walks on the vault of heaven. That's where God walks. That's his concerns. Not here on earth, Job. Will you keep to the old ways? Clouds hide him, and he walks on the vault of heaven. But will you keep to the ancient path which wicked men have trod? And we don't know exactly when Job lived. Was it before the flood or after the flood? But if it were after the flood, you would say the wicked people, you're just following in their steps, and they were snatched away. In verse 16, they were washed away by a river. I don't know for sure if he's talking about those who died in the flood, but they said to God, depart from us, and what can the Almighty do to us? He filled their houses with good things despite their wickedness, but the counsel of the wicked is far from me. Job has used those same words in 21:16. And he says, the righteous see it and they're glad, the innocent mock him. And they say, our adversaries are cut off, and their abundance in the fire has consumed. Now in verses 21 through 30, Eliphaz urges Job to return to God. Acquaint yourself with him. Yield now, be at peace with him, and good will come to you. Please receive instruction from his mouth and establish his words. The word instruction there in verse 22, is the word for Torah. And his instruction, if you return to the Almighty, good will come to you. In verse 23, you'll be restored if you remove unrighteousness from your tent. And then he says, you'll be so restored, you place your gold in the dust and the gold of Ophir among the stones of the brooks. Let's talk about this gold of Ophir in verse 24. Ophir appears to be a country in the biblical world that was well known for its gold. In 1 Kings 10:22, King Solomon received a cargo from Ophir every 3 years, consisting of gold, silver, sandalwood, pearls, ivory, apes, and peacocks. And we don't know where Ophir was located, but here's some suggestions. Some have more credibility than others, but the suggestions include India, Africa, especially Somalia, Peru, the Solomon Islands, and the first explorer there named them the Solomon Islands because he connected it with Solomon's gold. And then some have even suggested the Philippines, Eastern Samar. Here is an inscription that was discovered in 1946. It's a potsherd from Tel Aviv in Israel, and it mentions the gold of Ophir. It dates back to the 8th century BC. Now, let's go to chapter 23. And this is the 8th speech of Job. It begins in 23:1 and it goes through 24, verse 25. And we're still in the third cycle of speeches here. And here's the structure. There's an introduction. Then Job answered and said. Then verses 2 through 7, he longs to take his case to God. Yet in verses 8 and 9, he can't find God. Verses 10 through 12, he has confidence in God and his own his own integrity. That's Job's own integrity. Verses 13 through 17, he wonders at God's power. And then in chapter 24, 1 through 12, he argues that God is indifferent to injustice. He speaks of the seeming security of the wicked in verse 13 through 17, and he speaks of the fate of the wicked. So let's go through chapter 23, and then we'll get to 24. In verses 2 through 7, he longs to take his case to God. My complaint's bitter. My hand has become heavy. Oh, that I knew where to find him, that I might come to his seat, that and find him that he might judge me. Come to his seat is noun means a fixed place, his dwelling place. Job desires to appear before God's throne. Here's what I do. I present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I'd learn the words which he would answer, perceive what he would say. Would he contemn me with the greatness of his power? In verse 6, no, he would give heed to me. Surely he would pay attention to me. He'd listen attentively to what I say. There the upright would reason with him, and I would be delivered forever from my judge. It's interesting, he says here that he wants to appear before the Almighty, and then I'd be delivered from my judge. In verses 8 and 9, even though 2 through 7, he longs to take his case to God, in 8 and 9, he can't find God. I go forward, he's not there, and backward, I can't perceive him. When he acts on the left, I can't behold him. He turns on the right, I can't see him. He eludes me everywhere. I feel his power, but in vain I don't find him. Now 10 through 12, Job is still confident in God and in Job's own integrity. He knows the way that I take. He's tried me. When he tries me, I'll come forth his goal. I'm confident of my integrity. My foot has not or has held to his path. I've kept his way and not turned aside. I've treasured up the words of his mouth more than my necessary food, he says. Then in verse 13 through 17, he wonders at God's power, but he is unique. And who can turn him? And what his soul desire that he does. He performs what is appointed for me, and many such decrees are with him. I'd be dismayed at his presence. When I consider I'm terrified of him, I'm frightened. He has made my heart faint, and he's frightened me. I was not cut off before the darkness. I'm not silenced by the darkness, nor the deep gloom which covers me. Now in chapter 24, so we went through the structure, but chapter 24, one person says, in chapter 24 we run into all kinds of problems in the book. First, there are textual difficulties, and we're not going to get into those, which render many lines almost unintelligible. Secondly, the speech as a whole seems incoherent to many readers. Thirdly, chapter 24 is said to express sentiments that Job could never have uttered, that sound better on the lips of his friends. He says, why are times not laid up by the Almighty? So he's reflecting in this chapter on the problems in the world at large. Why is there no day of reckoning for the ungodly? Why are times of retribution not reserved for the wicked? And then he goes through the different, as so far has accused Job of various things. Job goes through the various sins of the wicked, that human society doesn't see in some ways the presence of God and his rule in the world. Some remove landmarks, he says. It's like moving the landmarks to gain more property. They seize and devour flocks. They don't care about law and order. They openly put out stolen animals to graze as though they were their lawful property. They take the widow's ox for a pledge. That could be the only thing that the widow has. They push the needy aside from the road. Out, and probably the idea here is they push the needy aside out of the way, depriving them of their just rights. And the poor hide themselves together as wild donkeys in the wilderness. They go forth seeking food in their activity, as bread for their children in the desert. They harvest their fodder in the field. They glean the vineyard of the wicked. They spend the night naked without clothing. And I don't think that's talking about the wicked. That's talking about the poor, that the wicked have stolen their clothes. They've been robbed. And so poverty and nakedness go together. They are, in verse 8, wet with the mountain rains and hug the rock for want of shelter, for the storm, during the storms, the mountain rains. They snatch the orphan from the breast. This is the helpless poor being attacked by the wicked, and they take a pledge against the poor, over the poor. They take in pledge that which is on the poor, maybe the idea, their clothing, because they cause the poor to go about naked, verse 10, without clothing. They take away the sheaves from the hungry. Within the walls they produce oil, they tread wine presses, but they suffer thirst. From out of the populous city, humans groan. And then notice he says in verse 12, yet God pays no attention. God does not pay attention to folly. Now in verses 13 through 17, he says that the evildoers will be enumerated. Others have been with those who rebel against the light. They don't know its ways, nor abide in its paths. In verse 14, the murderer rises at dawn. First light, there's the murderer. And he kills the poor and the needy. He's prowling around for prey, and immediately when daylight comes, he arises at dawn and he ambushes. He might be beside the road and kills the poor and the needy. And he takes away their property. And at night, he is a thief. The eye of the adulterer waits for the twilight, saying, no one will see me. And he disguises his face. And we'll see this in Proverbs chapter 7 in verse 9. But the thief is likened to an adulterer, to do this in secret. And in the dark, they dig into houses. Most houses were made of clay, and so they would just dig right through the wall, break through, and take whatever's in the house. And the morning is the same as thick darkness. And he's familiar with the terrors of thick darkness. During the day, they're shut up. At night, they go out and they rob. What's the reward of all this? Now, verses 18 through 25, what's the fate of the evildoers? They're insignificant on the surface of the water. Their portion is cursed on the earth. They don't turn toward the vineyards. Drought and heat consume the snow waters, and so does Sheol those who've sinned. A mother will forget him. The worm feeds on him. Only the worms will find pleasure in him. And his wickedness will be broken like a tree. He devours the barren. He wrongs the barren one. He does no good for the widow. He drags away the mighty, the valiant. And he provides them with security. So Job says at the end of this chapter, if this is not so, then who will prove me a liar? So what's he said, and what has he been saying in this chapter? He concludes with the injustice of God's moral government of the world. He's not whitewashing anything. He ends by demanding, if these facts are not true, then who's going to call me a liar? Now, in chapter 25, we have the third speech of Bildad, still in the third cycle of speeches in the dialogue. Here's the structure. 25:1 is the introduction. In verses 2 and 3, he speaks about the greatness of God. And then verses 4 through 6, he speaks about humans in light of that greatness. And really, you can't help but be struck by how short this speech is, how brief this speech is. He doesn't answer Job. He cannot. But he feels that this debate has reached a deadlock. And it just stands here. I mean, we just have 6 verses in this last speech of Bildad. And he says, dominion and all belong to God. So in verses 2 and 3, he talks about the greatness of God. Now, when these friends speak, sometimes, they're speaking the truth, but we have to look at it in its context. And that's an important principle in Scripture. We have to make sure we know who's saying what, who's speaking, what is the context. So he speaks about the greatness of God. Is there any number to his armies, to his troops? It's numberless, the celestial army, host that he has. So in verses 4 through 6, how then can a man be just with God? And that's repeating partly similar language of Eliphaz in chapter 4. In chapter 4, and also chapter 15, 4:17 and 15:14 through 16. How can a man be clean that is born of women? And he says, if even the moon has no brightness and the stars are not pure in his sight. He's contrasting humans with the luminaries of heaven, the moon and the stars. Even if the moon and the stars have no brightness, if they're dim in relation to God, then what about humans? And he says in verse 6, here's how much less man. And the word that he uses here for man is not the Hebrew word Adam, but the Hebrew word Enosh, E-N-O-S-H. And Enosh sometimes is used, in poetry it's used a lot of times as just synonym of Adam, of humans. But sometimes it refers to the lowliness of humans. How much less Enosh, the holiness, or the lowliness of humans. And then he calls him a maggot. It's emphasizing decay and destruction, and a worm. All right, we come to 26, and we'll look in this lecture in chapter 26 and 27. But this is part of a bigger section, 26:1 through 31:40. And it's the 9th speech of Job, and it's really 3 speeches here. This concludes the 3rd cycle in the dialogue. And the 3 speeches are Job 26:1 through 14, Job 27:1 through 28:28, and Job 29:1 through 31 verse 40. Here's the structure of this. In chapter 26:1 through 14 is Job's sarcastic reply to Bildad. 27, Job insists that he's speaking the truth. 27:7 through 23, he agrees that God will judge the wicked. He said, it appears the wicked are prospering, but he agrees God will judge the wicked. 28:1 through 28, is a discourse on wisdom. We'll save that for the next lecture. In 29, 1 through 25, he remembers better days. And in chapter 30, 1 through 31, he reflects on his current misery. 31, 1 through 34, he proclaims his innocence again. 31, 35 through 37, he desires an audience with God. And then 31, 38 through 40, the conclusion of Job's words. So we're going to look at chapters 26 and 27. In chapter 26, he answered and he said, and in verse 2, he says, "How have you helped the one who's without power? How have you saved the arm that has no strength? What help you are." And the pronouns here again are singular, and it appears that Job is addressing Bildad. He says, "What counsel you've given to the one without wisdom? What helpful insight you've given? To whom have you uttered words, and whose spirit was expressed through you?" Eliphaz spoke back in chapter 4, verse 15, if you remember, about a spirit appeared to him and told him to say this. In verse 5, and Job may be playing on that, in verse 5, Job says, "The departed spirits tremble under the waters and their inhabitants." He's showing God's greatness when he says the departed spirits tremble. I don't know if I wanted to end this lecture here, or let me go through this. Yeah, I think we'll just end the lecture here, and we will pick up in chapter. Let's. Yeah, we'll just end this lecture here, and we will pick up then with. This slide's obviously out of place, so let's go through chapter 26, and then we will end the lecture. Chapter 26 is his sarcastic reply, as we said. In verse 5, the departed spirits tremble under the waters and their inhabitants. The King James translates that dead things are formed from under the waters, the inhabitants thereof. The Hebrew term here for departed spirits or dead things is Raphaim, and they tremble. Here's a little more information on that. In the Hebrew Scriptures, sometimes the Hebrew word Raphaim is refers to giants. You can look at Genesis 14, verse 5, 1 Chronicles 20, verse 4, and then other places as here, and also Isaiah 26:14. It refers to the spirits of the dead. It's difficult to decide if Raphaim are the living or the dead or disembodied spirits. In Job 26:5, Davidson understands them as the thin and shadowy personalities of the dead. Job says they tremble. In verse 6, Sheol is naked before him. And Abaddon, destruction, it's a synonym for Sheol, has no covering. Now, in verse 7, he says he stretches out the north over an empty space. Some refer this interpretation the northern region of the earth. But he says he stretches out the north over an empty space and hangs the earth over nothing. Now, a lot of people have made arguments from Job and saying, well, look, they understood science, and perhaps he did. So one person said it's not surprising to have such a view in the book of Job when you had advanced astronomy in Babylon, Egypt, Greece. But one thing we have to be very careful with is that this is a book of poetry, and you have to be very careful making points on poetry and saying, look, he understood this. I don't know how much he understood. I mean, he may be saying something. He says in verse 10, he has described or inscribed a circle on the surface of the waters at the boundary of light and darkness. And the idea probably is that of a horizon. If you're standing, you're looking, it looks like a circle. You turn all the way around. Verse 11, the pillars of the earth tremble. The earth is called pillars of the earth here. Some commentators interpret this as the distant mountains, and it was thought by some that the vault of heavens rested upon them. They are amazed at his rebuke. He quiets the sea with his power, verse 12. He stirs up the sea. The older rabbis, the older commentaries from the rabbis understand this as stirring up and quieting and the miracle at the Red Sea. Then he says in verse 12, by his understanding he shattered Rahab, or Rahav. And back in Job chapter 9, verse 13, Rahav is mentioned. And Rahav, this is not Rahab from the book of Joshua. This is, as we said back there, more likely some sort of a monster dragon in myth. He says, by his understanding, he shattered Rahav. He first disturbs by his power, and then he calms the stormy sea. And this may be echoing some creation myths that people around Job's time had. But God is in control. He, in verse 13, by his breath the heavens are cleared, and his hand has pierced the fleeing serpent. In Isaiah chapter 27, verse 1 is the mention of that serpent again. It may be continuing the mythical struggle that's going on. This fleeing serpent. And then there was chaos, and it turned into light and order. Now remember, again, this is poetry. It's not saying Job believed all of this. By his breath the heavens are cleared. And then in the last verse of chapter 26, behold, these are just the fringes of his ways. How faint a word we hear of him, but his mighty thunder, who can understand? This is just the outer edges of his ways, just a whisper that we can catch. How can we perceive the thunder of his power, his omnipotence? We're finite humans. For all the progress that we made in science and other knowledge, that's just the fringe of the larger mysteries of God's infinite universe. Now later in the book of Job, when God finally speaks, God's going to bring up some of these things, and Job's going to say, I don't know. Job confesses that his wisdom is not the same as God's. He has something that's his and his alone. All right, so we're going to stop. This is lecture 7, and then next week, or in the next lecture, we will look at, we'll begin in Job chapter 27. So this is the end of lecture